set timeout is not quite what we want because it just calls a function one time. And you can put whatever delay you want on it, but it only calls it one time. And we really want to call it every second. Like if we call this every second, then it'll update this value every second and this value every second. So to get that, that's a repeated call, right? It needs to happen more than one time. So a method that you can do that is with setInterval method. And it is very similar to the set timeout. The first parameter is an actual function. Here's an anonymous function being used as that first parameter. And the second parameter is the time. But now it's not just a delay time. It's how often you're going to call it, and it will repeat it. It'll call it every 3 seconds over and over again. So this runs different than the other one. It's using the same thing. Once we click on it, it's going to call that set interval. So we click on it, 1001, 1002, 1003, and it comes up. We close it, 1001. Notice it starts the timer as soon as we get it. It doesn't wait for me to click OK. And so it's calling that timer, wait 3 seconds. It does the alert, waits 3 seconds, it calls it again. Now notice it's happening over and over and over again. Every 3 seconds it's calling this function, right? And it doesn't care whether I've clicked that OK or not. It just simply calls that every 3 seconds. If I wait for 3 seconds and don't click anything, and then I click OK, it's already called it. And that alert's sitting there waiting to happen. So this is the set interval, and it happens over and over again. And again, you can do it by putting an anonymous function, the entire function definition, as the first parameter. Or you can do a call to an external function, right, by putting the name of the function, or putting in quotes the name of the function and parentheses. So either of those work fine. Now, this is kind of fun. This is an example that's very similar to what we want to do. And that is to run this every second. So here, what it's doing, this function says create a new date object. That means when you do it with no parameter, that means that date object will be the current date and time. And then here it's saying, oh, get the locale time string, so just the time string, and put that time string in this paragraph. And that's what we're seeing happen here. It's putting that time string in that paragraph. But notice how it's changing every second. And that's because this set interval is calling this function every second. So every time it calls it, it creates a new date, gets the time string, and then puts that value in that paragraph. And so we're seeing it show up in that paragraph every second. Now this goes on indefinitely, and there is an option to stop it. Whether you start it, so to stop it, what you can use is what's called the clear interval. Now to do this, you need to capture the variable. So notice here that set interval is calling this method every second, right? 1000 milliseconds, and it's returning some value and storing it in my var. Well, the value it's returning is a timer ID. So it's saying, okay, we started this timer, it's gonna execute every second, and this runs indefinitely, and here's the ID for that timer. So if there's something you want to do with it, you can use this ID. So using that ID, you can call a method called clearInterval and give it the timer ID that you're talking about. It's possible to have multiple timers in a program, right? You might have, for different reasons, you might have different timers. So that's why you have to specify which timer you want it to apply to. And this shows how to stop it. So here we can do that. Here it's showing that second happening every second, right? That's the method we just saw. But now it has this other function, and this function's called whenever we click on the button. So there it's clicking, clicking, clicking. Now if I stop it, it clears that timer, and it won't call that anymore. That timer is done, and it's cleared, and it no longer will call that method. So that's a way to stop it. Here's kind of a fun method that shows how instead of using a button, you might use a condition to stop it. So this one, what it's doing is changing the width. So if we look on here, what we've got going on is this function move. And what it's doing is it's getting this bar. So here's this div called my bar, and that's just simply this gray bar. And it's just changing the width of the frame. So it's changing it, adding 1 to it. It's percent, right? So it starts at 0%, then it increments at 1, it's 1%, increment it's 2%, increment it's 3%. So it's just incrementing. But what it's doing is it's incrementing until it gets to width equals to 100. And then it's calling clear interval. So let's see how this works. So here, the set interval gets started, and it calls it every 10 milliseconds. This is pretty fast, so watch it happen. It changes the width every 10 milliseconds. And then when it gets to 100, when width becomes 100, it clears it, and that timer doesn't work anymore. Now let's change this to 1000, so it's every second, and then we can see it happening as well. So we run it that way, and now when we click it, what happens? Every second it changes the width. So we really can see this happening. That's taken us a long time, so let's go ahead and compromise, and let's do 100 milliseconds and run that. And now watch it, it'll be every tenth of a second, right? Okay, that it changes that width, and we can see it change until it gets to 100%, it would stop. Now we can test it. Is it really stopping, or can you just not see more percentages? So let's test LUTs. Let's stop it at 50% and run that, and we click on it. It's going. That set interval timing keeps going. Width gets to 50%, it stops. The timer no longer is executing. So that clear interval and using that timer ID stops it. So a way to continuously call a method, and then a way to make sure it doesn't get called again.